Most books you read today have been printed in a matter of minutes. However, in the olden days, it would take months to print books. The earliest books were printed using hand printing technology. This technology was first developed in China, Japan, and Korea. Let's go back to ancient China, where skilled woodblock carvers had started printing books from AD 594. In this technique, paper was pressed onto the inked surface of wood blocks. The pages were then stitched to form a traditional Chinese accordion book. This was also known as hand printing. Several copies of these books were made with the help of calligraphists. Initially, books were printed only for people appearing for the civil service examinations. The number of books multiplied later in the 16th century as the number of candidates increased. A century later, urban culture bloomed in China, which introduced reading as a leisure activity. They wanted to read a variety of books such as fictional narratives, poetry, autobiographies, anthologies of literary masterpieces, and romantic plays. During this time, rich women also took up reading and began writing poetry and plays. This reading culture necessitated the introduction of mechanical printing technology in the late 19th century. Eventually, mechanical presses from the Western countries were introduced in China. Interestingly, Buddhist missionaries from China introduced hand printing technology in Japan. In AD 868, the Japanese printed their first book, the Diamond Sutra. Later, in medieval Japan, books were available in plenty and at lower prices. A variety of books could be found at city libraries and bookstores. Meanwhile, an interesting art form called ukiyo emerged in Japan. It was introduced by painter Kitagawa Utamaro. In this procedure, an artist's painting was traced on a paper. This paper was then glued onto a wood block. Then, a skilled woodblock carver would carve a printing block to replicate the artist's lines. Later, this block was inked and printed. Sadly, in this process, the artist's original sketch would get destroyed. By the start of the 13th century, hand printing technology was introduced in Europe. Besides silk and spices, Chinese paper also traveled to Europe via the Silk Route. In 1295, Marco Polo returned to Italy with the knowledge of woodblock printing technology. Soon, this technology spread to other parts of Europe. Interestingly, two kinds of books were printed. Luxury editions were handwritten on vellum, a parchment made from the skin of animals for the wealthy, while cheaper copies were printed for others. To meet the increasing demand for books, booksellers started exporting books to different countries. Book fairs were organized at various places, and booksellers hired new scribes or skilled handwriters to meet the requirements. However, a faster and cheaper technology was needed. The first known printing press in the 1430s, developed by Johann Gutenberg, came as a much-needed solution. The first book he printed was the Bible. However, it took him 3 years to print 180 copies, which was still quite fast by the standards of that time. Despite this new technology being available, it did not completely replace hand printing technology. Illustrations and borders were painted while the text was printed. Between 1450 and 1550, printing presses were established in most European countries. In the second half of the 15th century, 20 million copies of books were printed. This production grew 10 times in the next century. Slowly, mechanical printing overtook hand printing technology, leading to the print revolution. Starting with woodblock printing in the year 200 to digital printing in the world of today, printing has come a long way. Books flooded the markets with the advent of the print revolution in the 15th century. They brought about several changes in the lives of the people. Earlier, only a handful of literate people had the privilege of reading books, while the common people shared knowledge orally. They listened to famous ballads and folk tales or saw performances. Thanks to the printing press, books were available in plenty and at low prices. Gradually, people began to shift from hearing to reading. The print revolution was also feared by many, as it was a medium to spread ideas freely. Print could greatly affect the minds of people and influence them, leading to debates and discussions. One such religious debate in 1517 by the religious reformer Martin Luther led to the division of the Roman Catholic Church and the beginning of the Protestant Reformation in Europe. The less educated, working people also began to interpret books in their own way. In the 16th century, an Italian miller named Monaggio reinterpreted the Bible. His unorthodox ideas angered the Roman Catholic Church, and he was executed. To prevent the rise of such rebellious ideas, the Roman Church imposed certain restrictions on publishers and booksellers and began to maintain an index of prohibited books from 1558. Another major impact that print technology had was the growing reading mania. By the end of the 18th century, some parts of Europe had a high literacy rate. Peasants and artisans could read too. Booksellers printed inexpensive almanacs, ballads, folk tales, and other entertaining material which were sold for them by peddlers. In England, travelling peddlers known as chapmen sold pocket-sized books or chapbooks for a penny. So the books were commonly called penny chapbooks. In France, inexpensive books called Bibliothèque Bleue were sold to the poor. Besides books, periodicals, newspapers and journals were also being published. At the same time, scientists like Isaac Newton and philosophers like Thomas Paine and Voltaire started publishing their discoveries and ideas. By the 18th century, people believed that books had the power to liberate society from despotism or absolute power. This belief made French novelist Louis-Sébastien Mercier declare his famous quote, "Tremble, therefore, tyrants of the world, tremble before the virtual writer." For these reasons, many historians believed there could have been a possible connection between the print revolution and the French Revolution. They pointed out that the writings by enlightened philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau were very popular and encouraged people to think radically. These writers wanted people to consider things with reason and logic over superstition, tradition and despotism of the church and the state. All these ideas from print paved the way for debates and discussions and made people question existing ideas and beliefs. Several cartoons and caricatures were printed which showed the French monarchy enjoying worldly pleasures while the common man suffered. This created hostility against the monarchy. However, the French people were also exposed to print propaganda from the church and the monarchy. Print had its impact. It did not influence people directly, but inspired them to think differently. The print culture saw several changes in the 19th century. Now that Europe had a high literacy rate, a large number of children, women and workers became a part of the reading culture. During this period, primary education was made mandatory for children. School textbooks and reading material, like folk and fairy tales for children, formed a major part of the publishing industry. Grimm's Fairy Tales, a popular collection of German folk tales, was published during this period. Interestingly, in 1857, a press was set up in France that printed books only for children. Women also showed a huge interest in literature. Penny magazines, meant for the working class, became especially popular among women. Several other manuals on etiquette and housekeeping were also popular at that time. Apart from reading, women also took up writing. Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, and Mary Ann Evans, better known by her pen name George Eliot, were some of the best-known female novelists of that time. Their writings defined the new woman as a person with strength, personality, intelligence, and determination. Lending libraries also became a means of educating people of the lower middle class. People in England began educating themselves. Some of them even took up writing with the help of these libraries. In the mid-19th century, the number of working hours decreased. This gave working people an opportunity to read and write in their leisure hours. Meanwhile, printers and publishers also came up with new strategies to sell their products. They now started publishing serialized novels. The Shilling series was one such popular series sold in England. Advertisements and notices were printed and pasted on walls of streets, buildings, and common places to attract buyers. Even during the Great Depression in the 1930s, they used a smart strategy of printing cheap paperback editions to maintain sales during the lean period. Apart from these strategies that changed the face of reading and the print culture, there was also a series of innovations in printing technology. By the mid-19th century, Richard M. Hoe of New York developed a cylindrical press that operated on electricity. It could print 8,000 sheets per hour. This press was useful for printing newspapers. In the late 19th century, the offset press was developed, which could print up to 6 colors at a time. This was followed by a number of other developments in the printing technology. These innovations and strategies in the 19th century transformed print and the reading culture to a great extent. Prior to the advent of print in India, people read manuscripts written on palm leaves and handmade paper. In the mid-16th century, the printing press was introduced to India by Portuguese missionaries. Several books were printed by religious priests and missionaries in South Indian languages. Though English presses were being imported to India from the late 17th century, printing developed much later in India. Towards the end of the 18th century, a number of newspapers and journals were being printed. Gangadhar Bhattacharya's Bengal Gazette was the first newspaper to be started by an Indian. Several religion-based debates began to take place in society around the early 19th century. Consequently, printing and newspapers became a useful medium to convey the views of both the social reformers as well as the orthodox religious practitioners to the people. The arguments over religious practices grew intense between the reformers and the Hindu orthodoxy. To reach a wider audience, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, a social reformer, published the Sambad Kaumudi, and to propose his views, the Hindu orthodoxy published the Samachar Chandrika. Later, two Persian newspapers, Jam-e-Jahan Nama and Shamsul Akbar, a Gujarati newspaper, the Bombay Samachar, started publication. At the same time, the ulama, the legal scholars of Islam and the Sharia, feared that they would be forced by the colonial rulers to convert, ultimately leading to the extinction of their community. Therefore, they began publishing newspapers containing Islamic teachings. The Deoband Seminary published several fatwas or legal pronouncements for circulation. The Hindus also began publishing religious texts in different Indian languages. Ramcharitmanas by Tulsidas was the first 16th century text to be published. Later, several religious texts were published in portable form, which increased the readership of these texts. As the reading culture grew in India, people wanted to read novels, stories and poems, as well as social and political issues. Later, visuals also became a part of the print culture. Several painters like Raja Ravi Varma provided their artwork for circulation. Caricatures and cartoons were also published, which depicted the social and political issues of society. Women became an important part of print culture too. During this time, several women writers wrote passionately about women's lives and their emotions. These included Kailash Bashini Devi, Tarabai Shinde and Pandita Ramabai, to name a few. While some liberal families educated the women of their houses, other conservative families kept women away from learning. However, there were many women like Raj Sundari Devi, who was married into an orthodox family and learned to read in secret. She wrote her autobiography, Amar Jibon, in Bengali. Similarly, there were many other publications that touched upon women's education, widowhood, widow remarriage, and the national movement. Reading and print culture spread rapidly in India. Batala, a place in Calcutta, was devoted entirely to the printing of popular books. Peddlers were sent door to door selling these publications. Books were also available at very low prices making them affordable for the poor. Public libraries were established in towns, cities, and some prosperous villages, making books more accessible. Print also helped disclose the ugly face of caste discrimination. Jyotiba Phule wrote about the injustice of the caste system in his book Gulamgiri. Later, B.R. Ambedkar and E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar passionately wrote on the caste system. In the 20th century, some less educated mill workers wrote about their experiences and feelings on the caste system and class exploitation. Kashi Baba, a mill worker from Kanpur, wrote Chote aur Bade Ka Sawal, and another worker wrote a collection of poems called Sachi Kavitaye under the pen name of Sudarshan Chakkar. The mill workers of Bangalore also set up libraries to educate themselves. These libraries were funded by social reformers who wanted to improve the lives of the workers and also make them aware of nationalism. Print culture played an important role in connecting people and brought about changes in Indian society. Print had a huge impact on its readers. This impact was underestimated by the East India Company till 1798. However, when the company started facing resistance owing to Indian nationalist publications, they started imposing restrictions on them. Initially, some Englishmen criticized the company's misrule and the ill behavior of some of the company's officers. This worried the company and they started putting controls on what was printed against them. By the 1820s, the Supreme Court passed certain regulations to control press freedom. The company only encouraged newspapers that wrote in its favor. However, in 1835, editors of English and vernacular newspapers filled a petition that compelled Governor-General Bentinck to revise the press laws. Later, Thomas Macaulay, a liberal colonial official, formulated rules that got back the editors their freedom. Soon after the revolt of 1857, the annoyed Englishmen demanded a clampdown on the local press. As Indian newspapers wanted to spread the feeling of nationalism and patriotism, the Englishmen started contemplating the imposition of strict censorship on such nationalist publications. Consequently, the Vernacular Press Act was passed in 1878. This gave the government the right to censor the reports and editorials in the vernacular press. If any rebellious writing was found, the press was warned. And if the press ignored the warning, then it had to face the consequences. The printing press of the offending publication was seized by the government. In spite of these controls, the number of nationalist newspapers increased throughout India. When the company attempted to suppress nationalist expressions, militant protests were launched by Indians. For example, when Bal Gangadhar Tilak wrote about the deportation of the Punjab revolutionaries in his paper Kesari, he was imprisoned, which in turn provoked protests all over India. Print culture became one of the major driving forces behind the Indian freedom struggle.